Well, thank you, Liz, for that marvelous introduction. Some of my family's here. I hope they heard it. So I'm really very honored to be here at the invitation of the Society, and I deeply appreciate it. My appreciation is shown by the fact that my new book is out there, and my gift to you is to take a copy. And if you don't like it, give it to your graduate students or whoever might be there. I thought before we get into the subject of consciousness, I did want to take 5 minutes or so and review briefly the history of this great society. You just saw evidence of it in the preceding section, where we've kept evolving, and now we have free and open discussions about extremely important topics. That's the Rockefeller University Bar. And where did this all get started? Well, Rockefeller is a great university, as you know, with many famous professors, and no more famous than this man, George Miller. And George and I used to meet there after work. I was across the street at Cornell. And Rockefeller Bar has a way of motivating its faculty by putting little signs around. And as you were about to order your drink, there was this cartoon hung on the wall, which is, yeah, he invented fire, but what's he done lately? And that sort of keeps you on your toes. And so George and I started talking about this idea of cognitive neuroscience. And this is really a story about his generosity and his vision, because he immediately incorporated the idea into his thinking, even though he at the time was a cognitive scientist. And we immediately arranged to have many of the leaders of cognitive psychology at the time, neuropsychology, it was called all kinds of things, come through Rockefeller, and talking to them, we cultivated the field, and through growth of that, convinced the other foundations, McDonald Foundation, to launch this new field. And you can see your favorite neuropsychologists there: Steve Hilliard, Brenda Milner, Sue Corkin, Endel Toving, Ann Treisman, Alfonso Caramasa, Morton Mishkin, Mike Posner, Pat Golden Marquis, Emilio Beatzy, Floyd Bloom, Steve Pinker, Helen Neville, David Premack, and Roger Shepard. They all came to New York enthusiastically to help us kick this thing off. But in the exploration of new ideas, I want to emphasize the role of play. And part of that early time, we used to hold these little meetings. And for those of you who hold meetings, let me give you a piece of advice. Pick a wonderful place where there's no cell phone activity. Take 10 people and stay there a week. And that's what we did. And we did it innumerable times. And ideas of memory, language, and all the rest of it were cross-fertilized. This particular one here was when Francis Crick became interested in neuroscience, and we went off to Maria. And it wasn't that you didn't have a bunch of people only interested in memory. You had a cross-pollination. There was Leon Festinger, Duncan Luce. What are they doing there? Well, they're smart. And they all take to having lively discussions. And of course, lots of things were going on in those late 70s and 80s. And this landmark paper, some of the derivatives of which we just heard this wonderful discussion by Steve Peterson, and Mike Posner, and Mark Rakel, and Peter Fox. They really launched 1,000 ships when brain imaging came in and demonstrated to the world that there could be a human neurobiology of normal cognitive processes. And their papers really set the stage for what has been 25 years of spectacular work. So spectacular that now there are discussions of where it goes, how to interpret it, and all the rest. All healthy, all positive. And then, of course, there was the founding of the Journal of Cognitive Neuroscience. That is the house my wife and I lived in, who, of course, is, in fact, Charlotte Smiley, the managing editor, who started the journal and to this day remains as the managing editor under the new leadership of Mark Desposito, who's done just a fantastic job. And all of this was in the brew while we said we got to have a society. And it was that simple. And we started in San Francisco in 1993, and as you can see from that picture, actually the keynote speaker then that day was Steve Pinker, and we were off and running. And now, as you know, it's a full-form society, and the whole operation is run by the members themselves, and it's really just terrific. So, thank you to all of them, and thank you for having me. So this little problem, the British have a thing about this problem. This famous quote, "Consciousness is a fascinating but elusive phenomenon. It is impossible to specify what it is, what it does, or why it evolved. Nothing worth reading has been written about it." Stuart Sutherland said that, a distinguished experimental psychologist. But it goes deeper than that. A few years back, I was on my way to Oxford for a convolute brain meeting, and I'm at the passport control, and the agent says, "So what do you do?" And I say, "Well, I'm a professor." "Well, what in?" And I said, "Well, neuroscience." He goes, "Ah," looking at my passport now. Neuroscience. Left brain, right brain? And I said, because he was taking a little too long, you know. I said, "Well, yeah, matter of fact." I kind of tried to cozy up to him a little bit, and I said, "I had something to do with that, actually." Stamps my passport, hands it back to me, and says, "Where are you going?" I said, "Well, to Oxford for a meeting on consciousness." Doesn't quite. Looks at me and says, "Have you ever thought about quitting while you're ahead?" So they're on to it. It's a tough problem. Well, we know there are lots of people worrying about it. And we can frame it that some people like John Searle of Berkeley think that it is there's this thing called qualia, the consciousness itself can be studied. It's something in the brain, you're going to find it, you're going to find the mechanism of it. Where you think someone like Dan Dennett, of course, thinks it's certainly interesting, but it's an illusion. It's just like magic. There's things in there working along, and then this thing happens. And illusions are powerful events, as we all know, even though we know these two tabletops are the same, and we cognitively understand it, and all that, we're fooled every time. And that's sort of his idea about how to think about consciousness. We're going to find out brain mechanisms, but are we going to be pleased because maybe the rest of it is in the illusionary category? So what I want to do today is tell you about my recent journey into this topic, and I'll give you a quick breakneck review of the matter from the history of philosophy in the last 2,500 years, then tell you a little bit about the current structural models, and then finally try to close with a couple of new ideas that are generated from fields that we normally don't read. So 2,500 years of human Western thought in 5 minutes. How's that? The Egyptians thought there was really no difference between nature and the human. We were all part of the same system. And then the big idea of the Greeks that actually the mind was generated by the biologic system and the brain. And then we go into the from then forward, we go forward to almost 1,500, where a lot of people thought that the fact that the mind was generated by the brain, but upon death, the soul took off, survived. It was immortal. And then finally, excuse me, Descartes, with the big discovery, of course, that in fact, the mentalism and dualism was the way to think about it. The mind was actually not part of the brain. So through these three ideas, that the mind is part of the brain, that the mind is part of the brain, but the soul leaves, and then the mind is separate from the brain. These three ideas are basically what our species has come up with over the last 2,500 years. And we take you to the modern times, and I'll tell about this in a minute, where in the modern articulation of what we think about it, in fact, Sperry and Crick and Mackay and Eccles, the three modern neuroscientists, broke their opinions broke down along those same fault lines. So the Egyptians believed that the nature and the world were one, and the Nile River had thoughts just like they did. And when she went on a flood, when it flooded, she was mad, and it wasn't because it had rained at the other end. So it went from a sort of thou understanding of the world to an it. And this was pointed out by Henrietta and Henry Frankfurt in their marvelous book. And the Greeks came along and made this fantastic idea. No, it's not a thou, it's an it. There's a third party. We can understand it. The universe is an intelligible whole, that a single order underlines the chaos of our perceptions. And just think what an enormous idea it is and how that redirected the destiny of the human condition. And their disciples decided to look at this thing called the human body, and some Greeks went to Egypt where you could dissect bodies, and Herophilus and Erostratus are considered sort of the fathers of modern neuroscience, and they came up and they found the ventricles, and they had this idea that spirits may flow through the hollow nerves. Not quite right, but pretty good given the time that there was no context at all. And that stood kind of there for 400 or 500 years till Galen came along, and while he couldn't dissect because you couldn't dissect in Rome, he was allowed to use gladiator bodies and baboons to do his dissection. And of course, he sets things on a different course. He put the rational processes in the brain, the appetitive processes in the heart, in the liver, and the spiritual in the heart. And he also, of course, did all the famous things of the arterial venous flow and a million other things. A true genius, and paved the way. Little did he think that that view of what was going on would stick around for 1,400 years. 1,400 years. We're worried about our 3-year grant renewal. None of us have the slightest belief that anything we're saying here is going to last for 1,400 years. I can tell you that. So then Vesalius comes along, he gets the anatomy right, and he basically puts everything in the brain. He left himself a little bit open on the spiritual question because he didn't want to lose his skin, as they say. And it took but there was a churning force of people trying to bring a physical basis to this whole idea of conscious experience of mind and spirit. And over in France, there was kind of a coffee house atmosphere, and Marcel Mersenne hosted a group, a salon, and it was quite a salon. He, of course, was a defender of Galileo, a fellow mathematician, a theologian, a philosopher, actually a musical theorist. And he believed church had to accept the universe was mechanistic. And he said God could rule a universe that followed natural rules. What's wrong with that? But that was, of course, heretical to some extent. But at that same coffee house was Pierre GASSENDI, who came up with the idea of a molecule. He was an atomist. He also was a French philosopher, a mathematician, scientist, priest. Everything is made out of atoms, which joined into molecules. did not find this belief heretical either, just like Mersenne. And God made atoms too, but no atoms in any combination could reflect on themselves. Therefore, human must have another soul, a rational soul that was immaterial. Well, guess who else was at that same salon? Rene Descartes. Can you imagine? I mean, that's a bar. Thomas Hobbes was there, we'll get to in a second. They're all working this stuff out. And Descartes, of course, simply had, I'm thinking and have no doubt about it. That's indubitable, unquestionable. Also, I know I'm wrong. I am not wrong. I am thinking. It is infallible. I think, therefore I am. And out of that, he derives his notion of dualism, but he was a true biologist. He believed in mechanism and biology in the body, as you know. And so while he liked the Vaucanson's duck, he believed that this irrational mind that he constructed and said it must be up there, it makes contact in the brain, as we all know, in the pineal gland, because that was the only undivided structure in the brain. So he also, I have to point out, his notion of brain as a machine came directly from Descartes. So Hobbes, as I said, was at that same salon, and he said no to this dualism, no to souls, didn't buy any of it, and basically, as I like to put it, thought like an engineer about the mind and brain. And he then had a fruitful life meeting other anatomists, and that's a long shot. All this stuff, I should say, by the way, is fascinating, and it has tentacles with other people and intriguing subplots. And every one of these slides I'm flying by here, scholars spend their lives on working out all the intricacies. So each one is rich. And then the philosopher that I think we look back on as really sort of setting the stage for the present is David Hume, where he said no to dualism, no to axioms, and yes to Newton, and let's establish the science of man and get this done. And Hume, to my way of thinking, said something that basically is what I'm going to say to you today. The mind is kind of a theater where several perceptions successfully make their appearance, pass, repass, slide away, and mingle in the infinite variety of postures and situations. And that is, hold that, just let that regurgitate, and hold it, not regurgitate. You know what I mean. But he's in each moment of time, there's something happening, and that's the key idea. And then over, and of course, in Germany and Vienna, people were accepting the brain had something to do with the mind and trying to go into the mechanisms of the brain. And all that's going on. And I'm just going to shoot forward to this meeting in 1962. As you know, or you should know, the Vatican has an Academy of Science. It's actually run by non-clerics. And in 1962, they held a famous meeting where the thought was it was time for them to look at this consciousness thing from a neuroscience point of view. And so they held a meeting entitled Brain and Conscious Experience. And these were the three players that we're going to identify because it's so important to the question. There was the conference organizer, Sir John Eccles, Nobel laureate, person that figured out how the synapse worked to a large extent, and a Catholic at the time. And he, nonetheless, was a dualist, okay? So go figure. Don Mackay was a British neuroscientist, a distinguished physicist, gone into information theory and all the rest of it. And he really had the engineering view, but he believed upon death there was an immortality of the soul. And then my mentor, Roger Sperry, who had the position that the brain generated the mind, but that there were emergent properties that then controlled the lower processes in the brain. So there they are. Those are the three ideas that the modern neuroscientists came up with. Eccles even drew it out. He didn't believe the mind hit the brain at the pineal gland. He thought it was in the supplementary motor area on the left side. Well, that's pretty specific. Sperry, my mentor, the way he put it, a molecule is the master of inner atoms and electrons. Its electrons are hauled and forced about in chemical interactions by the overall configurational properties of the whole molecule. Similarly, when it comes to brains, remember always that the simpler forces and laws, though still present and operating, have all been superseded in brain dynamics by the configurational properties of higher level mechanisms. So that was his way of capturing the problem. And I'm having a little fun with this. Mackay, you see the spirit leaving there? They captured that. And this was from some magazine I saw at the market. So those are the three positions. And of course, that's 1962. We're 50 years out from 1962. We've had this vast expanse of knowledge, some of which we just were reviewed for us. And I would say that there are many cognitive models that kind of think there's a system in the brain, and they talk about the big systems and how they interact in order to have a conscious moment. And of course, the neuroscientists have got a gazillion models about what patterns, what lobes, what circuits have to be involved in order for a conscious experience. And there are, of course, many, many terrific scientists working on it, have worked on it. Francis Crick, Stan DeHaan, Giulio Ciannone, Jerry Edelman, Bernard Bars, and Christoph Koch. And they all have their models, and they all, I would say, involve very much the notion of the systems and circuits, and we're going to figure out this circuit. We're going to figure out how this thing you and I enjoy every moment of conscious experience works. They're working on that mechanism. And so I would say they relying, though, on what I would call large centralized circuits. And I have a different hunch, and I'm going to say that we are full of specialized systems and circuits, and that if we're going to understand this problem of consciousness, we're going to have to understand how the circuits that enable particular skills that we have, how those circuits are enabled for that conscious moment. And what I'm going to suggest is that, in fact, what consciousness is a bubbling up of different specialized systems at a moment in time. And through time, it appears as a stream of conscious experience. Okay, that's a big statement, and it's time to see if there, why would anybody say that? So let me try to tell you. And this allows me to say that I continue to think that the most riveting moment in neuroscience is when you can see a split brain patient reveal to you that they have two mental systems, each with its own set of controls. And we've been studying this for a long time, as you know. And so to the question, can consciousness be divided? The answer to us, it clearly is, yes, it can. So, wow, conscious over here, right? Conscious over there, right? And how can, maybe it's multiple places. And that's what we want to examine. So in a moment for the classic neuropsychologist, I thought I'd show this short clip of my colleague several years ago testing case VP. I think it was about 2 or 3 months after surgery. And you can see for yourself the stunning sort of a revelation of what it's like. So he's just doing the standard neurologic exam. What do you see? How many fingers? And so forth. And I think it's self-explanatory.
Show me with your right hand what you see. Okay. Put it down. Relax. Show me with your left hand what you see.
1.
Good. Okay. You're looking right at my nose. Do you see that?
You get it?
Did you get it? Look right at my nose.
Okay.
Show me with your... Do you see anything now?
You know.
Any finger? Any fingers?
No. Well,
Okay.
they're like this.
Okay. Show me with your left hand what you see. Mimic with your left hand.
Like,
Good. Very good.
oh, they don't see it. It just did it.
Look at...
Oh, I don't see it, I just did it. So you can begin to think, well, there are multiple, I mean, here classically we're two mental systems, but maybe there are multiple mental systems. And then you think about disruptions to cognition, which the neuropsychologists and behavioral neurologists, and kind of we all know about, are truly astounding. You can get disruptions of space, memory, language of all kinds. And yet, wherever the lesion is, you would never say the person is not conscious. It's kind of like you can't stamp it out in normal cortical lesion kind of systems. You can't stamp consciousness out. And here's an example for those of you who don't see clinical patients at all. This is thanks to Nina Dronker's, a case of hers of somebody with Wernicke's aphasia. Where'd you go?
Today.
Yeah, right. I imagine it's those kinds that we have to get the white and black and so forth, which I'm not very good at.
Well, we'll give it a try. Okay? So, how are you feeling today?
My end regular today.
Yeah?
I terribly, very uncomfortable nug of how I dynated my tracheal, actually.
Okay. Okay. Tell me, have you been here before?
Nothing of...
Yeah. Have you been here before?
Oh, just my wife and my kids that have visitors of that, and my children.
So obviously...
Children that I know within my...
Severely, excuse me, disrupted in language, and yet remains conscious. So the model I want to play with here is that, in fact, we have all these systems in our head that we all know about, people study, and as I heard Mike Posner say the other day, there's a test to reveal any local area being activated by a specific task. It's all over the place. And the thought is that maybe as they play out, as one pops up in time, they become, through time, what we experience as conscious activity, and that actually each one of these particular specialties have its own enabling circuit that allow that skill to have a felt sense. That's what consciousness is, a felt sense of some capacity. And let me just show you how that you can possibly think about this. Now, give me a second to set this up because this is an absolutely fascinating thing. Here's case VP, a split brain patient. And we're going to show her a word, and the word's going to be breakfast, okay? Breakfast. And the way the test is set up, her fixation, she fixates between them in the middle of the word. So the right brain sees the word break, and the left brain sees the word fast. You and I would just see it as breakfast, right? But her right brain sees break, her left brain sees fast. She also, this particular patient speaks out of each hemisphere, okay? So when we show her the word, what is she going to do? Well, what she does is, in fact, the right brain speaks first, and you'll hear her say break, like in break. The left brain hears that, and it's got to do fast, right? And so it corrects the right brain. And she says, breakfast. But that's not why I'm saying. So that's just a little sidelight to the tape. What it is two mental systems just pouring out their stuff through time, and it all seems like a unified conscious experience. But in fact, it's modules expressing themselves through time. With this little model to think about, schema to think about, still remaining is the deeper question of this what is commonly called the explanatory gap. How do neurons and live cells and that kind of thing turn into mind? And this gap between mind and brain is known by all, worried about by all. It's also known by almost anybody in science and physics and elsewhere. The thought of figuring out an explanation for how brain generates a mind, how neurons generate a mental state, is something that has worried people for years. John Tyndall, a physicist at the Royal Institution, says the passage from physics of the brain to the corresponding facts of consciousness is unthinkable. How are these physical processes connected with the facts of consciousness? The chasm between the two classes of phenomena would still remain intellectually impassable. More recently, the philosopher Joseph Levine, in his book, The Purple Haze, said, we have no idea how a physical object could constitute a subject of experience. There seems to be no discernible connection between the physical description and the mental one. So a lot of people just think this isn't possible. And as far as I know, there's absolutely nobody that actually knows how it works. But we should be thinking about it. It's an important idea. And it turns out as you dig into the literature and read around in early philosophy and biology and up to the present, there are ideas that I think may help on this problem. And that's really kind of what I'm trying to do in the book that you all get on the way out, I guess. So I'm going to call it the Chicago School. And it's when Nicholas Reshevsky, the great math biologist and chess master, Michael Polanyi, the great philosopher, Robert Rosen, the great theoretical biologist, and Roger Sperry, the great neuroscientist and biologist and my mentor. They all went through Chicago. They all touched each other. And they all have this view, which I discovered in the process of writing this, that there's something else to figure out here. If we're going to figure this thing out, there's something else. We got to get our head around something. And Polanyi put it this way: you got to set the boundary conditions. So as he put it, a machine as a whole works under the control of two distinct principles. The higher one is the principle of the machine's design, and this harnesses the lower one, which consists in the physical chemical processes on which the machine relies. So you can have all that internal stuff going, but it's in a defined space. And Robert Rosen, who was right there with Polanyi as the theoretical biologist, put it this way: organization must be independent from the material particles which seemingly constitute a living system. Or kind of impishly, he said, the human body completely changes the matter it is made of roughly every 8 weeks. If science insists on chasing particles, they will follow them right through the organism and miss the organism entirely. So you're working in a space, and then these people, Rosen and Reshevsky and Polanyi, contributed to what is called a field of relational biology. What are the relationships between the structure, the architecture, the organization, and the physical chemical elements? As they put it, throw away the matter and keep the underlying organization. That was this. Now, people know this, but I wouldn't say it's a dominant view or feeling in those of us trying to figure out how the brain does its tricks. So what I want to sort of leave you with is describe the work of two current pioneers. One, very elderly now, and it's and my knowing about Howard Pattee came through writing this book. He was a Stanford-trained physicist who went on to theoretical biology. He spent his professional life at SUNY Binghamton, and wrote over the course of his professional career. He's still writing 50 or so incredibly lucid papers where he thinks deeply about what he calls the epistemic cut, the cut between inanimate and animate, and takes that all the way up to thinking about how the brain does its tricks. And also, I'll tell you a bit about John Doyle, a professor of control and dynamical systems at Caltech, who, if you've been reading the literature, is pushing, picking up on this and more about layered systems as how we should think about our problem. So Pattee takes you all the way down, all the way back. He wants to know about how inanimate stuff became animate. It's actually a fascinating story. He was sitting at a lecture in Caltech as a high school student, given by Linus Pauling. And Pauling sort of raises this question of Schrodinger's cat and the quantum physics, classic physics dilemma. And this young man got this question in his head, and then spent his life trying to figure it out. And so he wanted to know, what do you need to figure out how inanimate stuff goes from here, which follows all the physical, chemical principles of the world, and all of a sudden goes over here and becomes life. This is, by the way, a little editorializing here, this is real interdisciplinarity. I mean, I have no business reading this stuff, but you get hooked. And anything that encourages people to really experience true interdisciplinarity, we talk about it all the time, but we rarely do it, is, I think, really, really exciting, and it's fun, too. Anyway, editorial over. Replicability. You have to have replicability. Obviously, if something is going to have life, it's got to be able to be alive. It's going to be able to repeat itself, reproduce itself. In order to do that, it needs coded symbolic information. It needs a set of instructions to tell the system how to build another one. And then, as we know from life, it is evolvable. So that coded symbolic information can vary in its implementation. And in that variation, you can, of course, have natural selection work on the variation and that process go forward. And then finally, there's a complementarity. You have a hard-coded system that's somehow instantiated in the physical matter, and then you have a code that is read by the instructions, which then becomes what can be changed in its implementation. So replicability and evolvability become the clue for closing the gap. And so let me just say this and see if I can make it clear. By the way, this is all hopefully clear in the book. It is evolvable, and to evolve, the process has to introduce variation so natural selection can begin its work, and variation had to come from a code, an abstract, reliable representation of the instructions. The substrate of the code is a physical structure, but codes themselves are symbols, and symbols are subjective, follow no physical laws but rules, and there's the trick right there. The gap between non-life and life is bridged by an abstract but physical code, a substance. There is no spook in the system. So Howard Pattee's idea, let me restate it, and then we'll go, argues that life is to be seen as a layered system in which each layer has indeed demands its own vocabulary. How do the layers communicate across the epistemic cut? He calls this the epistemic cut, the gap, or as the Germans say, the Schnitt. I love that. On one side of the Schnitt, there is the firing of neurons. On the other, there are symbols, the representations of the physical, that also have a physical reality. Only one side of the Schnitt can be evaluated at a time, though both are real and physical and tangible. And this, then, is Bohr's complementarity idea on a larger scale. So this idea, it's a big idea. It's a way, you don't get this and then have a drink. You got to think about it and kick it around and roll it around. But it's also part of this whole layered idea that brings up my last point about with John Doyle at Caltech. So you think of layers, we all know what layers are. It's common in the computer science world, of course. Not so common in biology, but common in the computer science world. And just to make it concrete, it's not a perfect analogy, but it helps you think about it, is the hardware-software distinction. You've got a motherboard in your computer that's useless, and you've got software in your computer that's useless. And unless you put them together, you get a PowerPoint presentation out of the deal. There's two different layers going on there. There's the physical layer and the programming layer. Now, understanding what's going on between those two layers to produce the PowerPoint is completely hard. Very little vocabulary on it. And as Doyle says, it represents one of the deep scientific problems everywhere. How do layers interact? That we have layers, everybody knows, you all flew here. This little plane has 150,000 modules and subsystems and 1,000 computers. Used to be, this didn't have any computers, and the pilot actually was really manipulating the wires on the wings. The 747 has 1,000 computers in there, and the pilot's up there playing with a joystick while flying the plane, and it's because of all the layers that are allowing for stability, complexity, but also fragility. So to wind up, is consciousness an instinct? Well, as William James says, instincts are the functional correlates of structure. A single complex instinctive action may involve successfully the awakening of impulses. So there could be a quick instinct, but then something like language, like consciousness. It's just the rattling off of little instincts into one that looks like something else. And actually, William James made the bold statement, every brain cell has its own individual consciousness, which no other cell knows. I don't go there, but I thought I'd throw it in. And think, well, okay, well, is there any evidence for this kind of thing? And just let me refer to this exciting new work where they figure out in Drosophila now that there's 29 specific networks in the brain, each controlling a specific layer. And the authors propose that what complex behaviors is just a resequencing of these 29 capacities, boop, 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 so that way, boop, 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 this way, and so forth. And you get it. So there's an underlying notion that there are specific systems that are reordered through time to produce a behavior. So the bubbling brain, I line myself up with these people. William James put it, every impulse and every step of every instinct shines with its own sufficient light and seems at the moment the only eternally right and proper thing to do. It's done for its own sake exclusively. And David Hume, as I said earlier, the mind is kind of a theater where several perceptions successfully make their appearance, pass, repass, glide away, and mingle in the infinite variety of postures and situations. And Sir Charles Sherrington, the great British physiologist, how far is the mind a collection of quasi-independent perceptual minds integrated psychically in large measure by temporal concurrence of experience? simple contemporaneity can just join it all. So it's in the book, read it, but I should leave you with the one thought of William James. Good humor is a philosophic state of mind. It seems to say to nature that we take her no more seriously than she takes us. I maintain that one should always talk of philosophy and these kinds of issues with a smile. Thank you very much.